The riddle at the edge of the desert. On the edge of the Giza plateau, one face has been staring east for so long that no one alive remembers when it started. 73 meters of lion body and human head, carved from a single ridge of bedrock limestone, older than almost anything else still standing on Earth. Everyone agrees it is ancient. Almost no one agrees on exactly how ancient or whose face is carved into that battered stone. The official story says a single pharaoh, Khafre, ordered it built around 4,500 years ago as part of his pyramid complex. A small but persistent group of geologists insists the evidence says something far stranger, that the Sphinx may be thousands of years older still. If they are right, someone was carving monuments in Egypt before Egypt existed as a civilization at all. Tonight we are opening the case file on the Great Sphinx of Giza, the evidence, the myths, and the argument that still divides Egyptology. This is not a simple story. It survived a missing nose, centuries buried to the neck in sand, and its own name being erased. The ancient Egyptians themselves called it Horumaket, Horus in the horizon. The word Sphinx came centuries later, borrowed from Greek myth. For most of its life, it has faced due east, watching the sun rise over the same horizon through the rise and fall of every Egyptian dynasty. So how do you actually date a monument carved from solid bedrock with no inscription anywhere on its body naming its builder? You start where any investigation starts, not with theories, but with the stone itself and the story written into its weathering. Then you follow the paper trail, temples, causeways, and a 3,500-year-old stone tablet left between its paws. And finally, you have to reckon with a century of competing theories, some backed by careful science, some by pure imagination. By the end, you can decide for yourself who you believe. But first, let's meet the leading suspect. His name was Khafre, and according to most archaeologists, this was his idea from the very beginning. Buried to the neck. Rewind 3,500 years to a young Egyptian prince out hunting alone in the desert near Memphis. His name was Thutmose, and he was not first in line for the throne. Two older brothers stood ahead of him. Exhausted by the midday heat, he found shade beneath the towering head of a half-buried stone giant and fell asleep. In his dream, the god of the horizon spoke to him. "Clear the sand from my body, and I will make you king." Thutmose woke, ordered the excavation, and years later did indeed become Pharaoh Thutmose IV. He commemorated the promise on a granite slab, now called the Dream Stele, still standing between the Sphinx's front paws today. That stele is the earliest surviving text that treats the Sphinx as already ancient, already half forgotten, already worth digging out of the sand. It does not say who built it, but one damaged line on that same stone mentions a name, the fragmentary syllables of Carve. For thousands of years after Thutmose, the desert reclaimed its victory again and again. The sand always came back. By the time European travelers began sketching Egypt in the 1700s, only the head and neck rose above the dunes. Early sketches from 1737 already show the same damaged, noseless face that travelers still recognize today. The first serious attempt to dig it fully out of the sand did not come until 1817, led by a Genoese adventurer named Giovanni Caviglia. Caviglia's crew uncovered the Dream Stele itself, exposing Thutmose's own promise to the world for the first time in centuries. But the body was reburied by wind again within a generation, as it had been so many times before. The Sphinx would not be fully freed from the sand until the 1920s, under a French engineer named Émile Barrès. It took Barrés's team more than a decade of grinding, careful excavation to finally expose the full lion body we recognize now. For the first time in over 1,000 years, the entire monument stood in open air, all 73 meters of it. And once it could finally be seen in full, the real argument about its age could finally begin. Who broke the nose? Ask almost anyone why the Sphinx has no nose, and you will get the same confident answer. Napoleon's soldiers shot it off for target practice. It is one of the most famous stories in Egypt, repeated in guidebooks and classrooms for 2 centuries. It is also completely false. The proof is a set of drawings made in 1737 by a Danish explorer named Frederick Louis Norden, 61 years before Napoleon ever set foot in Egypt. Norden's sketches already show the exact same broken, noseless face. Whatever happened to that nose, it happened long before any French cannon arrived. An even earlier account, from a French traveler in 1546, already describes the face as damaged and no longer beautiful. So, if it was not Napoleon, who was it? The most credible answer comes from a medieval Arab historian named al-Makrizi. Writing in the early 1400s, he recorded that a Sufi preacher named Muhammad Sa'im al-Dar was outraged to see local farmers leaving offerings at the Sphinx's feet, hoping for a good harvest. Believing it encouraged idol worship, he is said to have defaced the face and was later executed by an angry mob for it. That account cannot be proven with certainty either. Centuries of wind-driven sand and simple erosion may share the blame. What we do know, from the drawings and travel accounts, is that the nose was already gone hundreds of years before Napoleon's army ever saw Egypt. Fragments once believed to be pieces of that missing nose are now held in storage at the British Museum, still debated by researchers. The lesson is a useful one for everything else in this story. The version everyone repeats is not always the version that actually happened. Napoleon does deserve some credit here, just not for the nose. His scientists were among the first to document the Sphinx with real academic rigor. Their detailed drawings, published in the early 1800s, sparked a wave of European fascination that never really stopped. The case for Khafre. Let's start with the mainstream case, the one accepted by the vast majority of working Egyptologists. The Sphinx was carved for Pharaoh Khafre around 2500 BC. Khafre was the 4th pharaoh of Egypt's 4th dynasty, son of Khufu, builder of the Great Pyramid and builder of the 2nd pyramid at Giza himself. The Sphinx sits directly on the causeway leading to Khafre's pyramid complex, positioned as if it were always meant to guard the approach. Right beside it stands the Sphinx Temple, and just south of that, Khafre's own Valley Temple, built from the exact same style and scale of megalithic limestone blocks. Geologists have traced those very blocks back to a specific source: the enormous trench carved out of the bedrock to free the Sphinx's own body. In other words, the builders appear to have quarried the Sphinx and its neighboring temples from the very same stone at the very same time as a single unified project. Inside Khafre's Valley Temple, archaeologists found statues of the king himself, carved in the same hard diorite, wearing the same regalia seen on the Sphinx's head. Many Egyptologists believe the Sphinx's face was carved to resemble Khafre specifically, the same strong jaw and calm, distant gaze found on his statues. The dream stele itself, the one Thutmose left between the paws, was carved from a reused stone doorway, and its pivot sockets match the entrance of Khafre's own temple exactly. That single detail physically links the stele, the Sphinx, and Khafre's temple complex together, long before modern archaeologists ever started debating the question. Mark Lehner, one of the most prominent Egyptologists to study the site, has mapped the Sphinx and its enclosure for decades and consistently supports the Khafre attribution. His surveys show the enclosure, the temples, and the pyramid causeway were engineered together as one coherent architectural plan, not as separate, unrelated structures. For decades, Egypt's own former antiquities chief, Zahi Hawass, has been the loudest public defender of this traditional dating, dismissing rival theories in interview after interview. To supporters of the Khafre theory, the evidence forms a tight, self-consistent picture. One king, one workforce, one unified building project. Critics call this circumstantial. Nowhere on the Sphinx itself does an inscription say, in so many words, King Khafre commissioned this monument. That absence of a direct inscription is the single crack in an otherwise fairly solid case, and it is the crack that an entirely different theory tries to widen. That theory does not come from an archaeologist at all. It comes from a geologist who simply looked at the rock and saw something nobody expected. His name is Robert Schoch, and in the early 1990s, he made a claim that put him on a collision course with almost the entire field of Egyptology. To understand why his idea caused such an uproar, you first have to understand what he actually saw carved into the enclosure walls. It is time to walk the trench alongside him and look at the same weathered stone that started the whole argument. So, let's go stand where he stood, geology textbook in hand, and see the Sphinx enclosure the way he first saw it. A geologist walks the enclosure. Robert Schoch was not looking to rewrite Egyptian history. He was a geology professor at Boston University, invited to Giza to examine the Sphinx's stone. What caught his attention were deep, rolling vertical grooves running down the enclosure walls, very different from the flatter, more even weathering seen elsewhere on the plateau. To Schoch, this pattern looked less like sand-laden wind and more like something water does, rain, running down a slope over and over for a very long time. Wind erosion tends to cut horizontally, following the direction it blows. Water erosion tends to cut vertically, following gravity down a slope. Schoch argued the grooves on the Sphinx enclosure looked far more like the second pattern than the first, and that raised an enormous problem. Egypt's climate has been desert dry for the entire span of recorded Egyptian history, roughly 5,000 years. For that kind of prolonged rainfall erosion to have happened, Schoch concluded, the Sphinx would need to have already been standing during a much wetter period, thousands of years earlier. Climate scientists do agree that a genuinely wetter phase existed in North Africa, sometimes called the Neolithic subpluvial, roughly 7 to 5,000 BC. If the Sphinx's enclosure had already been carved by then and exposed to that rainfall, it would make the monument at least twice as old as the pyramids beside it. That would mean someone in Egypt was quarrying and carving monumental stone thousands of years before the first pharaoh ever wore a crown. Schoch published his findings in academic geology journals starting in 1992 and presented them alongside an independent researcher named John Anthony West. The claim spread far beyond academic circles almost immediately, fueled by documentaries, magazine covers, and a public always hungry for a story about lost, forgotten civilizations. For a moment in the 1990s, the Sphinx's age was front-page news around the world. Egyptology, a field usually measured in careful centimeters and cautious footnotes, suddenly found itself at the center of a very public fight. So was Schoch right? To answer that, we need to look closer at exactly what kind of rain Egypt actually gets, and when it stopped. Because the climate argument, it turns out, cuts in more than one direction. Rain in the desert? Even mainstream climate scientists agree Egypt was wetter in the deep past. The disagreement is really about exactly when and how much rain actually fell. Some geological studies suggest occasional heavier rainstorms continued in Egypt, even during the pyramid building era itself, just centuries apart, not constant. That matters, because Schoch's theory does not actually require nonstop rain. It only requires enough cumulative rainy episodes over a long enough stretch to carve those grooves. Critics counter that even occasional Old Kingdom rain, over 4,500 years, could plausibly produce similar weathering without requiring an extra 5,000 years of age. There is also the question of the rock itself. The Sphinx enclosure is carved from several distinct layers of limestone, some far softer than others. Softer layers erode faster and more dramatically than harder ones, sometimes producing deep, rounded grooves that can look, at a glance, remarkably like water damage. Some geologists argue this natural banded softness alone can explain much of what Shoke observed, no exceptional rainfall required. Others point to a very Egyptian process called haloclasty, salt crystals growing inside porous limestone, then expanding and literally flaking the surface apart, grain by grain. Haloclasty does not need rain at all. It thrives on humidity, groundwater, and the daily temperature swings of a desert climate. It is a slow, patient process, and over thousands of years, it can carve grooves that look eerily similar to the ones water would leave behind. So, the vertical grooves everyone points to may not be a smoking gun for extreme age. They might just be ordinary Egyptian weathering, misread. Shoke has responded to these critiques directly over the years, arguing the depth and pattern of the grooves still goes beyond what salt weathering alone typically produces. The debate, more than 30 years on, has never fully resolved. Reasonable geologists still disagree about which process explains the enclosure best. What is not in dispute is that this single geological argument reopened a question Egyptology thought it had already closed. The pushback. Beyond the rock itself, mainstream Egyptologists raise a more basic objection. Where is everybody else's evidence for a lost, advanced civilization 10,000 years old? If a sophisticated culture carved a 73-meter monument in 7000 BC, we would expect to find their tools, their pottery, their settlements somewhere nearby. Decades of excavation across Egypt have never turned up a Sphinx-building culture from that era. Not a workshop, not a graveyard, not a single tool. Geologists James Harrell and K. Lal Gowrie, both specialists in Egyptian limestone, published detailed rebuttals questioning Shoke's water erosion model on purely geological grounds. They pointed to comparable weathering patterns on other, more securely dated Old Kingdom structures nearby, arguing similar grooves appear even where extreme age is not in question. There is also the quarry connection we mentioned earlier. The stone removed to free the Sphinx's body was reused, block for block, in Khafre's own valley temple. If the enclosure had already existed for thousands of years before Khafre, his builders would have had to somehow quarry fresh stone from an already finished, already ancient trench. That scenario is not impossible, but it adds an extra unproven step that the simpler explanation does not require. There is also the matter of Old Kingdom stoneworking skill. Khafre's era left behind exquisitely precise masonry across Giza, more than capable of producing a monument like the Sphinx. Supporters of the older date sometimes argue Old Kingdom Egyptians could not have carved anything so ambitious. The archaeological record from Giza itself argues otherwise. Radiocarbon dating adds another layer. Organic material recovered from mortar and associated structures at Giza consistently returns dates clustering around Khafre's reign, not thousands of years earlier. No radiocarbon sample anywhere on the Giza plateau has ever returned a result supporting a 10,000-year-old date for the enclosure. None of this proves Shoke's original observation about the grooves was wrong. It simply means most independent lines of evidence still point back to Khafre's era. Most, but importantly, not every single Egyptologist has settled comfortably on that answer either. A handful of researchers remain genuinely open to an earlier core structure. One idea gaining some traction is a hybrid, that a natural rock formation existed on the plateau long before Khafre, and his workers simply reshaped it into the Sphinx we know. That idea does not require thousands of years of extra history for the finished monument. It just pushes the mystery one step further back into geology rather than archaeology. We will come back to that natural formation idea shortly, because recent research has actually tested it in a laboratory. First, though, there is a stranger detour we need to take through Atlantis, psychic prophecy, and a hidden hall of ancient records. A detour into Atlantis and the Hall of Records. In the 1930s, an American self-proclaimed psychic named Edgar Cayce gave hundreds of trance readings claiming refugees from the lost city of Atlantis had built a secret vault beneath the Sphinx. He called it the Hall of Records, supposedly holding the collected knowledge of a vanished, technologically advanced civilization destroyed by catastrophe. He predicted it would be discovered and opened sometime between 1996 and 1998. That deadline came and went, and nothing was found. None of Cayce's specific claims about Atlantis or a buried hall have ever been supported by archaeological evidence anywhere on the Giza Plateau. But the idea proved remarkably durable. And by the 1990s, it had merged with two other unconventional theories into one shared narrative. The first was Schoch's water erosion theory, which we've already covered. The second came from an engineer named Robert Bauval and involved the stars. Bauval's Orion correlation theory proposed that the layout of the three Giza pyramids mirrors the three stars of Orion's belt as they appeared in the sky around 10,500 BC. Mainstream astronomers and Egyptologists have challenged the precision of that stellar match. And note, the pyramids were built centuries apart, not as one instant snapshot of the sky. Even so, the combination proved irresistible to popular imagination, an ancient super-civilization, a secret vault of lost knowledge, and a monument built to mirror the stars. It inspired best-selling books, television specials, and decades of speculation that continue circulating online to this day. It is worth being honest about what has actually been tested. Ground-penetrating radar and seismic surveys have scanned beneath the Sphinx's paws multiple times since the 1970s. Those scans have found small natural cavities and fissures in the bedrock. None have ever revealed a man-made chamber matching Cayce's description. So no, there is no verified evidence of an Atlantean library beneath the Sphinx. That part of the story remains exactly what it started as, an unproven prophecy. What is genuinely true, and arguably more interesting, is that scans have picked up some unexplained void-like anomalies in the rock nearby, which we will get to later in this film. For now, the honest, scientific verdict on Atlantis beneath the Sphinx is simple: an evocative story, a specific testable prophecy, and to date, exactly zero confirming evidence. Let's leave psychics and lost continents behind and go back to something we actually can test in a lab. How wind alone shapes solid rock. Did the desert carve the Sphinx first? In 2023, a team of researchers at New York University asked a completely different question. What if nature started shaping the Sphinx before any human ever picked up a chisel? Their focus was a landform called a yardang, a ridge of rock naturally sculpted by wind-blown sand, where softer layers erode away and harder layers survive as a raised shape. The desert around Giza is full of these formations, and some of them, from certain angles, look uncannily like crouching lions. The researchers built a simplified model in their lab, a soft clay mound embedded with harder material, then ran a steady stream of fast-flowing water over it to mimic years of desert wind. Over time, without a single human hand involved, the mound eroded into a shape with a raised head, an arched back, an undercut neck, and paw-like ridges stretched in front. It looked, remarkably, like the basic silhouette of a crouching sphinx, formed entirely by natural fluid dynamics, not by any sculptor's plan. The Sphinx itself faces almost due east, directly into Giza's prevailing wind direction, exactly where this kind of natural shaping would be expected to happen. That does not mean nature carved the whole monument. Nobody studying this seriously claims the detailed base, his mane and paws appeared without human hands. What it suggests is a more elegant origin story. Ancient builders may have noticed a natural lion-shaped rock outcrop already sitting on the plateau and chosen to finish what wind had already started. That would explain why the Sphinx sits exactly where it does, on a low ridge rather than a perfectly flat chosen site, unlike almost anything else the Egyptians built from scratch. It also offers a tidy explanation for why the body proportions look slightly compressed compared to the more detailed, clearly hand-carved head. If a sculptor is refining an existing shape rather than starting from a blank block, that kind of proportional mismatch is exactly what you might expect. The study does not resolve the Khafre versus Shok debate on its own, but it does offer something both camps can actually agree on. Whatever came first, wind and geology likely played some part in the Sphinx's basic shape, long before the final deliberate act of carving. It is a rare moment in this whole controversy where mainstream science and the fringe theories are, in a sense, both partly right. With that natural origin in mind, let's look at what was deliberately added to the Sphinx later and just as deliberately taken away. The missing beard and the broken Uraeus. Look closely at old photographs and drawings of the Sphinx, and you'll notice something missing from its chin. A long, ceremonial pharaoh's beard. Large fragments of that beard were recovered from the sand around its paws and are now split between the British Museum and the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Most Egyptologists believe the beard was not part of the Sphinx's original construction at all, but was added later, during the New Kingdom, over 1,000 years afterward. That single detail, an addition rather than an original feature, is a small but telling clue about how later pharaohs kept reshaping the monument to fit their own reigns. The Uraeus, the rearing cobra once mounted on the brow to symbolize royal protection, is missing too, likely lost to the same centuries of weathering and deliberate damage. Fragments of a similar cobra ornament have been found nearby, though scholars still debate whether they belong to the Sphinx itself or a related statue. Even the striped Nemes headcloth we recognize today shows heavy restoration, patched and repaired across centuries by different rulers with different priorities. Ramesses II, roughly 1,000 years after Khafre, ordered his own restoration and rededication of the monument, adding inscriptions honoring himself alongside the older structure. Roman-era governors did the same centuries later, adding their own repairs and even a small brick stairway for visitors to climb up and view it. In other words, the Sphinx we see today is not one moment frozen in time. It is a patchwork, rebuilt and reinterpreted by nearly every era that encountered it. That patchwork nature is part of why dating it precisely is so difficult. Different parts of the same monument may genuinely date to different centuries. Untangling the original core from everything added later has become its own entire specialty within Sphinx research. Centuries of repair. The most dramatic restoration chapter, though, did not happen in antiquity at all. It happened within living memory, and it very nearly went badly wrong. Starting in the 1980s, Egyptian authorities launched an ambitious project to repair centuries of crumbling limestone along the Sphinx's body. Some of that early work used modern cement and incompatible stone, materials that trapped moisture instead of letting it breathe the way the original soft limestone had. Within a few years, chunks of that new material began cracking and falling away, sometimes taking pieces of the original ancient stone with them. In 1988, a section of the right shoulder collapsed, sparking public alarm and an official investigation into how the restoration had gone wrong. The project was halted, its methods heavily criticized, and Egyptian authorities brought in geologists to figure out what had actually gone wrong with the earlier repairs. The fix, when it finally came in the 1990s, was almost stubbornly old-fashioned. Hand-quarried limestone blocks, matched as closely as possible to the original stone's density and porosity. Each replacement block was shaped and fitted by hand, using techniques that echoed the same patient stoneworking the Old Kingdom builders themselves would have recognized. No modern adhesives, no incompatible cement, just dry-fitted stone, assembled the way it had been 4,500 years earlier. The American Research Center in Egypt partnered on later phases of the work, bringing in additional conservation science to monitor moisture, salt, and structural stress. Groundwater has proven to be an ongoing, quiet threat, rising and falling with irrigation and urban development nearby, carrying damaging salt up through the porous limestone. Pumps and drainage systems installed around the plateau now work continuously just to keep that groundwater from climbing back up into the monument's base. It is a strange thought. The single greatest ongoing threat to a monument that may be 4,500 years old, or considerably older, is modern plumbing several kilometers away. Every restoration decision made today is also, in its own way, a bet on the monument's true age. Repairs meant to last decades matter less if the core is millennia older than assumed. Conservators today lean toward extreme caution, minimal intervention, and constant monitoring, treating the Sphinx less like a repair job and more like a patient under long-term care. UNESCO added the Giza pyramid fields, including the Sphinx, to its World Heritage List in 1979, formally recognizing the site's fragility as much as its fame. Every crack sealed today is also a small vote of confidence in one dating theory or another, whether the restorers say so out loud or not. With the physical monument stabilized, at least for now, researchers turned their attention to a much deeper question. What, if anything, lies hidden beneath it? Scanning the Sphinx, voids beneath the sand. The search for hidden chambers beneath the Sphinx did not start with psychics. It started with legitimate American geophysicists in the 1970s. A team from the Stanford Research Institute used seismic refraction and electrical resistivity, essentially reading how sound and current travel differently through solid rock versus empty space. Their 1978 survey did detect a rectangular anomaly beneath the left paw, an area where the reading suggested something other than solid bedrock. That single anomaly became the seed for decades of follow-up speculation, some careful and scientific, some considerably less so. Subsequent surveys through the 1990s, using ground-penetrating radar and additional seismic work, confirmed some cavities exist, but found no evidence of a large man-made chamber. Test drilling in some of these spots came back consistent with natural fissures and small voids in the limestone, the same kind of cavities common across the plateau. In April 2024, a joint study by the Getty Conservation Institute and French archaeological researchers used far more advanced, ultra-precise three-dimensional radar scanning across the wider plateau. Their results revealed multiple interconnected voids beneath the western flank of the Pharaoh Khafre Plateau, and unusual, seemingly hollow zones directly adjacent to the Sphinx itself. That does not confirm Casey's Hall of Records, and the researchers themselves have been careful not to claim it does. Voids in porous desert limestone are common and can form naturally through dissolution, old quarrying activity, or simple geological faulting with no human construction involved at all. Still, the scale and interconnection of these particular voids has genuinely surprised some researchers, and follow-up investigation is ongoing as of this recording. Egyptian antiquities officials have publicly urged caution, noting that anomaly readings have led to overhyped headlines before, and that careful excavation, not speculation, is the only way to know for certain. For now, the honest answer is the same one archaeology usually gives. Something unusual may be down there, but we do not yet know what it is. That uncertainty is not a failure of science. It is exactly how real archaeology works: slow, careful, and allergic to jumping to conclusions. Whatever is eventually found, or not found, beneath those paws, it will be excavated the same patient way everything else at Giza eventually gets uncovered. With all the evidence now on the table, it is finally time to weigh it, the way any good investigation should. The verdict. So, let's lay the case out piece by piece, the way we would any cold file. The traditional theory, Khafre around 2500 BC, as part of one unified pyramid complex. The evidence here is genuinely strong. Matching quarry stone connects the enclosure directly to Khafre's Valley Temple. The dream stele physically ties back to his temple doorway. Radiocarbon samples across the site cluster consistently around his reign. No confirmed archaeological trace of an advanced 10,000-year-old civilization has ever surfaced anywhere at Giza, despite generations of dedicated searching. The water erosion theory, intriguing, backed by a real credentialed geologist, and pointing to genuinely unusual weathering patterns that deserve honest explanation. But it faces real geological pushback from other specialists, and it still cannot answer where the tools, settlements, or skilled workforce of that much older culture actually went. The most likely synthesis, favored by a growing number of researchers, borrows a little from both sides without fully endorsing either extreme. A natural, wind-shaped rock ridge may have sat on the plateau for millennia before Khafre's time, already suggesting a crouching lion's silhouette to anyone who looked closely. Khafre's workers, around 2500 BC, then transformed that natural shape into the detailed monument we recognize, quarrying its enclosure and reusing the stone in his own temple. That single hybrid theory would explain the Sphinx's unusual sight, its slightly compressed body proportions, and its finely detailed, clearly later carved head, all at once. It does not require abandoning radiocarbon dates, matching quarry stone, or the dream stele's clear connection to Khafre's temple. And it does not require inventing an entire lost civilization with zero physical trace anywhere else in the archaeological record. It simply says, nature sketched the outline, and Egyptian hands finished the masterpiece, sometime around 4,500 years ago. That is not the most dramatic possible answer. It will not sell as many mystery documentaries as an Atlantean supercivilization. But it is the answer the actual evidence currently supports. Science, unlike legend, is allowed to change its mind the moment better evidence turns up. If a confirmed structure is ever excavated beneath those paws, this verdict could shift overnight. Until then, the most responsible answer is also the most honest one. Mostly Khafre, likely working from an older natural outline, and still, in places, genuinely uncertain. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. So why, despite all this evidence, does the 10,000-year-old theory refuse to just quietly disappear? Why the riddle refuses to die? Partly, it is simply a better story. A lost, advanced civilization, wiped out by catastrophe, hidden knowledge waiting to be rediscovered. That narrative taps into something very old in us. It is more dramatic than careful radiocarbon dates and quarry block matching, even if the quieter answer happens to be the one better supported by evidence. Partly, it reflects a genuine, healthy skepticism toward official narratives, a sense that ancient people are so often underestimated by modern experts. That skepticism is not baseless. Egyptology has been wrong before and has revised its own conclusions many times as new evidence emerged. But being open to revision is not the same as concluding, without solid evidence, that mainstream researchers must be hiding something. The genuine mystery here does not need embellishment. A monument this old, this damaged, this endlessly rebuilt, is already remarkable enough on its own merits. It survived a missing nose, a missing beard, centuries buried past its neck, a cement restoration gone badly wrong, and thousands of years of shifting political power around it. It has been called Horemakhet, Then Sphinx, worshipped, defaced, forgotten, and rediscovered more times than any single culture can fully claim credit for. Maybe that is the real riddle worth solving. Not just when it was carved, but why it has mattered to every single civilization that has stood in its shadow since. Every generation seems to project its own anxieties and hopes onto that same weathered face. Lost wisdom, divine judgment, ancient mystery, or simply a very good pharaoh with very good stonemasons. The stone itself has never once explained itself. It just keeps sitting there, facing the sunrise, letting each new century argue on its behalf. If you ever stand in front of it yourself, you are looking at genuinely ancient stone, carved by real skilled human hands, whatever the exact date on the label finally turns out to be. That is worth more respect than either extreme version of the story usually gives it. Not a boring, settled fact, and not a wild, unproven fantasy either. This has been Clue Series. If you want to keep chasing history's open cases with us, subscribe and we will see you in the next investigation.